Hi there. Welcome to Boardroom Minutes. My name is Mark Brantley, and we have an interesting topic on today entitled Board Oversight or Micromanagement. Do you know your role? Well, first, I would like to welcome everyone back to the channel. I appreciate your viewership. And if you haven't subscribed as of yet, why don't you hit the subscribe button? And then also, why don't you like this episode if and only if it was beneficial to you? So you can wait until after you hear the content. And if it was beneficial, hit the like button. Or if you want to do it in advance, you're welcome to do it as well. Again, our topic on today is board oversight or micromanagement. Do you know your role? And that's a very important topic because oftentimes, as board directors, we don't quite understand our role, even though we may have an expertise in a particular area. Being a director is having board oversight, whether it's a for profit organization or a not for profit organization, whether it's a credit union, a bank, or a religious institution. Uh, your board has oversight. And there's a thin line when it can occur where a director or a board can cross over into the lane of micromanagement. So it's important for you to know your role. And one of the biggest challenges boards face today is understanding where that line is between governance and management. And today we'll clarify the difference between board oversight and micromanaging and how to provide strong oversight while staying in your lane. You know, Boardroom Minutes is dedicated to providing clear and practical insights for today's boardrooms. And that's all types of organizations, as I have mentioned in previous episodes, nonprofit, not for profits, religious institutions. But with this particular subject matter, it sort of crosses across the gamut of organizations. And I think everyone, if you are on a board, whether you're a director or a trustee, that this episode will be applicable. So, why don't we dive in further? So, what is the core challenge? And that's knowing the difference between micromanaging and rubber stamping, because we have a tendency to do one or the other, and both are at opposite sides of the spectrum. You can micromanage when you start to intrude upon the lane of management, day to day operations, and boards often drift into managing day to day operation. And there's a confusion as to where the accountability lines are drawn. And then on the other side, you have rubber stamping, where the board would just approve everything that management proposes. And that's swinging the other way from micromanaging. And you then begin to approve management decisions without the proper and real oversight that is needed. But both extremes, whether it's micromanagement or rubber stamping, they undermine effective governance and organizational health. So the key is striking the right balance between the two. And that's why we have to sort of discuss the difference between governance and management, because it's the board's responsibility to govern. It's their governance responsibility as fiduciaries. And we talked about that last week. What a fiduciary is, it's a person or persons entrusted with the assets or the property of another, and you are responsible for ensuring its safekeeping, ensuring that the assets are protected. And typically, when we speak of corporations and organizations, you are in an entrusted position when you serve as a director or a trustee. So your responsibility is governance. And then for management, their responsibility is operations. And there shouldn't be a blurring of the lines. Management shouldn't intrude upon governance unless, of course, you have executives that are on the board serving in that capacity, but the board should not be intruding on management's territory with regard to day-to-day operations. So what do we mean by governance? Well, one is that the board should protect the mission and the vision of the organization. Stay on mission. Make sure everything that is in the strategic plan aligns with the mission, because the last thing you want to do is drift off course and utilize resources in a wasteful way and bring the organization in an area where it shouldn't be. And then also, the board is responsible for hiring and evaluating the CEO. Now, typically, some would say that the CEO is the only employee of the board. Well, that's not necessarily true. We do know that the CEO is hired by the board, and then the CEO hires his management team, and the management team hires their staff. However, the board still has oversight. And just because the board is only responsible for hiring the CEO doesn't mean it relinquishes their oversight for all of personnel in the organization. And then board's responsibilities are to approve budgets that typically management develops on behalf of the board, do the various financial statements and metrics, and it's up to the board to review it, digest it, make sure everything is in order before approving it. And then it's up to the board in its proper governance responsibility to ensure accountability, to make sure rules and regulations are followed, make sure the organization is in compliance. And then its responsibility is to establish policy. Boards are policymakers, and the management team is responsible for recommending policies, but it's the board that approves them. It is also management's responsibility to develop procedures and practices, but that's not part of the board's responsibility, because that is for day-to-day operations. So when we speak of management and operations, the executive management and the respective teams, they run the daily operations of the organization. And there should not be any intrusion on directors' part in terms of interfering with the role of management. And management also implements the strategy. They execute the strategy. They make sure that the strategic plan is carried out. You also have management is responsible for the staff. Those persons that they have hired, they are responsible and are direct reports to management. And then it is management's responsibility to report to the board. Everything goes up, flows up. And these reports, whether they're financial reports, audits, they ought to be given to the board for review. And then finally, it is management that handles most, if not all, of the tactical decisions. That's the decisions regarding day-to-day operations. Two main points and analogies. One is that the board is like a navigator. The board navigates for the organization. It charts the course, it sets the direction, and it watches the horizon. If you were on a ship, let's say, you make sure that the board doesn't crash into anything unseen. So you set the direction of the organization and you watch to make sure that the organization is on course, and make sure it doesn't veer off into the wrong direction, and keep your eyes focused on the goals and the mission, which is the horizon. And then management does the driving, right? Management is behind the steering wheel. Uh, if it's a gas powered ship, it is the captain that hits the pedal and also makes the turns. Uh, the management knows exactly where and why the boat should be steered. Management should know when there's a storm approaching, financial storms, and should know what the weather is so that the ship can be safe and sound. So, some real world examples. For instance, for the board to approve, we talked about approving the annual budget. And that's important because when you are involved in strategic planning, you need to have the resources to carry out these strategic priorities, but they also have to be in alignment with the mission. Your resources, your strategic priorities, namely your strategy, need to align with your mission. And the board should not be approving any budget that is not in alignment with the strategy. And if the strategy is not in alignment with the mission or vision, then the budget should not be approved, especially if it exceeds the spending limits. The last thing you want to do is to spend beyond your budgetary means. And then management, once the budget is approved, it is up to them to allocate the line items within that budget on a weekly basis. It is up to management to make sure the resources are utilized in a productive way to execute the strategic priorities. So when you have boundaries, delineations between governance and management, we know that clear boundaries between the two, between board oversight and management, prevents confusion and it maintains accountability at the right level. Now, when you are micromanaging, that means when the board is intruding on management's purview, there are certain red flags that appear. And one red flag is when boards directly contact staff. Board members calling upon staff directly for updates instead of going through the CEO. There's a chain of command. And if the CEO reports to the board, then the board should be asking the CEO for updates. Now, I'm not saying that the board should not ever ask questions of management, but mainly when you want updates and you want reports, it should channel through the chief executive officer. And then when it comes to operational approvals, the board insisting on approving vendors, that's part of day-to-day operations. Board should not be involved in the vetting of vendors or even hiring mid-level staff. There you can get caught up in conflicts of interest. If directors want family members hired, that is up to the CEO and his team to hire mid-level staff and to make, as we mentioned before, tactical decisions. And then a red flag is when long meetings are spent on operational issues instead of general strategic oversight. In other words, there should be an agenda, a board agenda that handles general oversight, not spending time on tactical and operational issues, because that is unnecessary and is a red flag when it comes to separating governance from management. Then, as we mentioned, on the other side of micromanaging is the red flags that are raised by rubber stamping, right? And that's when you have a board that doesn't ask questions or doesn't ask the right questions. But the board becomes a rubber stamp. Everything that management reports or provides, it is approved by the board. Instead of the board making sure there's meaningful discussion and even challenging some of the proposals and the assertions that management proffers. And then you allow management to dominate. You allow management to control the agendas when the board should be setting the agenda. Now, management controls their agendas with their management team, but when it comes to the board meetings, it is the board that controls the agenda. And there has to be some pushback because management at times may want to exceed the strategic priorities, especially when it comes to the resources that were approved and that are dedicated to carry out those priorities. Um, then there's passive evaluation. No meaningful evaluation of the CEO. There should be performance evaluations, not just pro forma, but there should be solid metrics. There should be a rubric established. Sometimes you can contract that out with a third party so that your CEO can be properly evaluated. Because the last thing you need is a CEO that is a renegade or a CEO that's really incompetent and was hired without your knowledge, knowing that they did not have the professional expertise needed to run the organization. Now, how boards stay in their lane? One is that you clarify the roles in writing. That's why it's important for there to be a policy manual. It's important for there to be a board management responsibility matrix that outlines the responsibilities for those directors that are being onboarded, that are new, so that they then could have a reference point in order to stay in their lane. And then you want to ensure that these policies are spelled out, that they're codified, and you draw the distinction between governance functions and management functions. Secondly, the focus is on strategy for the board, not on tactics. Now, we don't focus as a board on executing the strategy. What we do is we want to have oversight and approve the strategy and allow management to execute it, allow management to formulate the tactics on how to carry it out. And that's why it's important for if there is a policy issue or an operational issue, that those questions are not asked to the management team or to mid-level managers, but they're asked to the CEO. And it's up to the CEO to give those answers. And then you also have to hold management accountable. You approve your outcomes and your goals, and you let management decide on the implementation. You want to measure the execution by the management team. You want to measure their results. You want to report on the outcomes so that you then can make recommendations in order to have a course correction for the organization. And then finally, you want to stay in your lane. Simple as that. Less traffic accidents when everyone stays in their lane. And the healthiest organization are those where boards and management know their roles. Boards govern and management manages. And when each stays in their lane, accountability is clear, the mission advances, and trust is strong. So the role for the board is providing oversight, setting strategic direction, and ensuring accountability. For management, it's to execute the strategy, manage the day-to-day operation, and then deliver results. And that is to be reported to the board. All right. Well, that ends our discussion on today. Thank you for joining me in another episode of Boardroom Minutes, and that was board oversight or versus micromanagement. Do you know your role? Hope this was beneficial. And as I mentioned before, if it was, why don't you hit that like button? Also, subscribe to this channel as we bring you these clear, practical insights for today's boardrooms. Thank you again. This is Mark Brantley, your host, signing off for Boardroom Minutes. Hope to see you on next week.